This is the fourth lecture. I want to start with David Hume. What we're going to look at today, particularly, is his compatibilist version of free will uh, via his inquiry into human understanding. And particularly, we're going to look at the doctrines of necessity and the doctrine of liberty. So we started out with this idea that maybe the entire world is, completely determined in some rather, simple, almost Newtonian fashion, right? That one everything that began at the beginning of the world has caused everything that has happened afterwards, and there's been no real choice of anything in between. And in the same way that a rock has no choice over the path that it takes when it rolls downhill, we have no choice over the path we make. We're just really fancy rocks. Okay, so that's classic, um, uh, a crude version of classic determinism and hard determinism. So, this experience that we have when we're making a choice, this experience that we are freely choosing to do one thing as opposed to another, or not to do anything, which is kind of key right now, um, that leads us to the idea that we are free. We have this very robust sort of experience of being free when we make choices. And the hard determinist would say that we're deceived. Um, the libertarian believes that either the universe is not determined, but our will is not itself caused by something. It is itself an uncaused cause, right? Like um, the cosmological argument for the existence of God, right? God has to exist because something had to initiate all the causes, subsequent causes and any effects in the universe, and something had to initiate the movement of everything in the universe without itself needing to be moved, right? So it's the unmoved mover or the uncaused cause. So, in that same way, the libertarian would say that kind of thing exists somewhere uh, within us, within our mind, such that we can make free decisions. Um, Without being, completely caused by the rest of the universe. When we look at Descartes, I think will be in the next lecture, you'll get a sense of his solution for that kind of problem. And he's going to split the mind and the body into two separate substances, and that will help to give us a view of libertarianism, which should not be alien to us, I should say. Okay, so David Hume, Scottish Enlightenment, smart guy, uh, deep skeptic and empiricist. He believed that all the information that we have comes from our experience. That logic and mathematics were really relating relations between ideas, but the ideas themselves, I think, were all initiated via sense impressions. Um, that is actually a little bit of a controversial idea that logic comes from experience, that we are born tabula rasa. David Hume was not quite a student, I would say, of Locke, but very seriously influenced by Locke. We have a lot of evidence now that we are not born tabula rasa. We are born with certain kinds of pre-constructed sorts of things that allow us to learn language faster, for instance. Okay, anyway, um, there's a lot to get in here with David Hume. There's some very, I think, interesting and important issues related to philosophy of science that I think are potentially, at least, counterintuitive, which means usually hard to believe. And it's difficult to try to do this without seeing if any of you are making sense of this. It's difficult to do this without feedback. Um, I think I'm going to gloss over. There's a thing called the problem of induction that David Hume is heading towards. It's not what he called it. And it's a really important concept if you're going to be working in science, etc. But let's see if we can get at it the simple way. Okay, so David Hume. There is nothing in any object considered in itself which can afford us a reason for drawing a conclusion beyond it. Even after the observation of the frequent or constant conjunction of objects, we have no reason to draw any inference concerning any object beyond those of which we have had experience. So he's saying that no matter how many times you've seen one thing after another, one thing after another, one thing after another, it's our mind that creates, makes the mental leap, leap of faith really into saying that this thing causes that other thing. Having to do, I think, particularly with our, relation in time, our limitation of being, only here in the present. That it's a habit of mind that when we see one thing happen and another thing happen, we always assume the one thing caused the other. But there's nothing intrinsic to the world that lets that happen. An example of this is the idea that we've, had this experience of the sun rising, every day, and it seems through history we've had, thousands, if not millions of years of the experience of the sun rising. Will the sun rise tomorrow? Probably. Is it necessary that the sun rises tomorrow, given that it has done so for millions of years? No. It may very well be the case that the sun does not rise tomorrow. Something else could happen in between. Like we could get struck with an asteroid, I don't know, a stray black hole comes in and sucks us all up. So the sun does not have to rise tomorrow, even though it has risen millions of times before. There can always be something. And we can always be mistaken, too, about one thing that causes another. So basically, David Hume is saying we have to be a bit skeptical when we talk about one thing causing something else. He's basically saying that Laplace's demon is really impossible because no matter how much information we have in the past, we can't exert with perfect certainty what will occur in the future. And that when we do so, it's a leap of faith, right? Based off the information that we have. So, given that that's the case, we can't, when we think about whether or not we are completely determined as human beings, right? Are we free? Are we not free? It's a question of metaphysics and the nature of causation in the universe. Is it the case that everything that has come before necessitate what comes after, guarantees with absolute certainty what comes after? Or is there some little bit of room for doubt that has to be there? David Hume thinks so. And a lot of philosophers after David Hume think so as well. So David Hume says, look, this was all in the previous chapter from what I asked you to read. Okay. We're going to look at this particular chapter. He sort of says, all right, given this idea that he has about causation, that it's necessarily a little bit sketchy. We can't completely count on it. It's a metaphysical problem that can't completely be resolved. Are we, necessarily caused, or are we not necessarily caused? He says, well, let's talk about those things that we can talk about. This turns out to be a very influential kind of idea later on with the Vienna Circle. But anyway, Um, okay. So let's talk about what we can talk about. So instead of, sort of hard determinism, he argues that we have something called the doctrine of necessity, which is like, it's not that the world is determined or the universe is determined, it's deterministic. Everything behaves in a law-like fashion to the extent that we can know things, right? So it's not perfectly predicted, but it's predictable, we can. So the doctrine of necessity. By observing the constant conjunction of events, we infer that one is the cause of the other. Okay. And according to hard determinists, right, now hard determinists, we ought to do that too, and our usual view of free will and its relationship to predictability and the law-like nature of the universe is that the more law-like the universe is, the less free we seem to be, right? That talking about determinism, probably reading Francis Crick, his astonishing hypothesis, leads us to think that we are not free. There's no possibility of it. But here, he takes a very interesting tack, which is to note that human behavior mostly seems to follow the doctrine of necessity, and that is not a threat to our capacity for free will. And if anything, it's required for us to be, have a meaningful existence and meaningful interactions and make meaningful choices. And this is a perfectly natural part of our interactions with each other. We expect each other to be pretty predictable. And we'd be deeply disturbed if we weren't. And David Hume gives us several reasons for thinking that. First of all, we don't find it difficult, really, to understand or read ancient works from the past and find them the same kinds of emotional responses that people had to, say, Sophocles plays. Thinking about the great Greek tragedies here. We also feel, pathos and grief, and right along with them, and the play Antigone. Her brother's body is thrown out into the plains in front of the city to be eaten by dogs. And this is a terrible thing. And she wants very badly to bury her brother. Her brother was basically, sent out of town on a rail, I guess. No, he was decided he was a traitor. He was killed and was thrown outside the walls of the city. So as you go through Antigone, even though in a way, it's an alien environment, right? And even alien considerations and alien experiences, we nevertheless understand and can, empathize with Antigone about her grief over her brother. So in history, our experience with history leads us to believe that human beings have always pretty much reacted the same. We have the same kind of emotional reactions to particular circumstances and so forth. A lot of commonality. Also, when we interact with each other, we find that we're very predictable. And by and large, if somebody does something that we don't expect, we don't think that causation has failed. We think that there's just some other factor we don't know about. Okay. And David Hume gives us the example of somebody who is hangry, really is hungry, and that's made them cranky, or that they have a um, sick or sore tooth. They have a toothache, and that'll make you cranky. So, doctrine of necessity dictates that by observing the constant conjunction of events, we infer that one is the cause of the other. The universe is not determined, it is deterministic. It is not, completely laid out in, laws from beginning to end. It is law-like, the activity of the universe. So talking about what we can talk about, we could talk about, general predictability. Well, if this occurs, then that occurs. So given that we can't really think about necessarily whether or not our will is itself caused, because it's kind of a deep metaphysical puzzle that we'll never be able to solve, we should just resolve ourselves to sort of thinking about regularities within the universe as what our universe is like, as opposed to being completely determinate. Okay, so that's his view on the doctrine of necessity. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Right. Well, okay, sorry, I should have skipped ahead to this. Not only is the universe deterministic, we expect determinism to work in our interactions as well, because human behavior has not changed throughout history. We're still, greedy. Anyway, human interactions are mostly predictable. And when they're not, we just don't know something. And this is not a threat to our capacity to make free decisions. Okay. So compatibilism is the idea that the deterministic universe is still consistent with a free will. And what is happening is that the compatibilists or soft determinists are not committing themselves to whether or not the will is metaphysically free of everything else. They're just saying, we can't really talk about it, so let's talk about what we can talk about. Okay. And David Hume notes that the metaphysical problem of whether or not our will is caused or by the universe or it is uncaused does not resolve issues of moral responsibility for us, that there's some deeper things at play there. If it's the case that our will is, uncaused or free, well, what makes us do the things that we do? We may not have control necessarily. It might be just random. And should we hold people morally accountable for that? Probably not. Maybe not. And likewise, if we're completely determined, right, by the nature of the universe, it was because so-and-so was raised that way, or, the environment that so-and-so grew up in, genetics, and so on and so forth, should we assess their moral responsibility differently than if we thought they were completely free when they made a decision? So, but compatibilism allows us to say, okay, we're going to hold you responsible for doing X. Specifically, through using Hume's doctrine of liberty, this demonstrates how this is possible. We want to know, did this person do that thing? Was this person at liberty to do this thing? William James, by the way, American philosopher, father of psychology, another schmat guy. To the extent that our actions are determined by our choices, they are done freely. To say that something causes something else means that, in our experience, the occurrence of the first thing is customarily followed by the occurrence of the second. To say that someone acts freely means simply that a person's action follows from choice or act of will. So instead of worrying about what causes the will, we're going to focus on what the will causes itself. We're not going to worry about where that will comes from. We're going to say, was that something you did of your own accord, right? According to your own decision, or is it something you were forced to do? We're not going to worry about the metaphysics of it. So the doctrine of liberty, we are at liberty when we are acting in accord with our will. We are not at liberty if we are being forced in some way to act against our will. By being physically restrained, for instance. I think Hume said, tell me whether or not someone is in prison or in chains, right? That would be the kind of physical restraint we're talking about. They couldn't help, the drowning victim because they were, locked up in chains. He also recognizes that we can be constrained to act via coercion. Coercion is sort of an unethical persuasiveness, attempt to influence somebody's behavior, as opposed to persuasion, which is where you use reasoning to try and get somebody to change somebody's behavior. So, for instance, someone you love could be being held hostage. They could be holding a gun on you. And so, I didn't save the drowning victim because they were holding, my children hostage, etc. So, at least then we can make allowances and, think more about moral responsibility. So you're free when you're able to act on your will. When you're neither physically restrained or you're not being restrained via coercion. Note that there are many different ways you can be constrained. You may lack the resources to do what you want to do, so that's arguably a form of constraint as well. So, but you're at liberty to do a thing when you're able to choose to do it and act on it. Okay. How does the prospect of a truly free will potentially solve the problem of evil? Of course, we looked at this in the last unit on the problem of evil, and that is if we are truly free, then we can do both good things and evil things, and I'm sure neutral things as well. And therefore, either it's the case that God does not have to bring about evil into the universe because we do it as a consequence, evil and suffering, or because it comes in as a consequence of our free choices and actions, or that's one kind of issue. The other reason is because sure. Well, sufficient to say it's resolves the problem of evil by saying that it's human beings that bring free will into the universe, and being free, we can do things that are good and things that are not so good. And unless we were capable of doing that, we wouldn't be truly free. Presumably, God wants us to be free to make choices such that we can choose to love God of our own free will. That's much more meaningful than if God constructed us so as to love God as robots. Okay, so that's how that ties back in. This is the next thing we're going to look at. Descartes' resolution is the mind-body problem. If the mind does not obey physical laws, then there is no problem, right? It's not physically determined. We're going to look at res cognita versus res extensa. Talk about, do thoughts have extension? Extension is existence in the universe as a material thing. It potentially resolves the issue of freedom of the will and preserves the possibility of an eternal soul existing independently of the body. So that'll be the next lecture. I just love this cartoon, comic I should say. I used to think correlation implied causation. Then I took a statistics class. Now I don't. Sounds like the class held. Well, maybe. And down here at the bottom, this is the mouse over that was associated with this particular comic. Correlation doesn't imply causation, but it does waggle its eyebrows suggestively. It gestures furtively while mouthing, "Look over there." So this is, of course, from XKCD, which I recommend highly that you take a look through it if you haven't yet. One more thing to think about here is the concept of authenticity, which is being true to yourself or true to your character. And having talked a lot about determinism and how our will may not be free, I think it's worth emphasizing that even under very serious coercion, people can do the thing that is not expected and resist and do what they think is the right thing to do. So as you can see here, this is a very good-sized crowd. People are performing the Nazi salute, which you can't see over here. I guess to your left as you're facing your screen, or maybe you're right, I don't know. That they're pointing towards is actually Adolf Hitler, who was there to see a ship, I think, being birthed into the ocean, whatever they call that. You put it in the water for the first time. And out of all of these people, talk about social pressure, this one person is standing with his arms folded. We actually know who that is. His name is August Landmesser, and he wanted to marry a woman and was told that he could not do so because she was Jewish. And he resented the Nazis ever after that, and probably with other reasons too. But it's just worth pointing out that in the face of all this social pressure and potential danger to himself, he stands out, making a statement that we can all, I hope, if we're in the same circumstance and faced with lots and lots of pressure to do the thing that is wrong, that we have the power within ourselves to refuse and do what we know to be right. Okay. If you're interested, there's some biological determinism issues that are related to experiments of Libet, who reports that there is basically brain activity that can be recorded prior to us acknowledging or seemingly to even be aware that we've made a decision. This potential that occurs, and some people think that's an implication that we don't actually have free will, that our unconscious is making decisions for us before the conscious even knows about it. And I just think that's funny. Okay. Oh, and I just stuck this at the end because I thought it was cool. Just a representation of sensibility and imagination, and here's the mind thinking about things, and so forth. Okay, thank you very much for your patience. We're going to skip the last thing here, the last slide. I should have taken it out. Again, thank you for your time.